So my name is Leigh. I'll be moderating the panel today, and we are going to get started. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon for Solve Climate 2030. And I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, which we do at all Ryerson events. So Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples and Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I myself am coming to you from just east of Toronto. So I'm part of territory subject to the Williams Treaty and the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog. And I just wanted to reflect a little bit on that idea of peace, friendship, and respect in that statement, because Indigenous peoples have not been met with peace, friendship, and respect within Canada and across Turtle Island. And I think that we have some really stark examples of that over the past year. We're going to be talking a lot about climate justice today. And it's important to acknowledge that Indigenous communities are on the front lines of the climate crisis. We have fisher folk on the East Coast, the Mi'kmaq, who have been fighting racism and trying to defend their Aboriginal rights and title. Across the country on the West Coast, we have the Wet'suwet'en peoples who have been resisting pipelines in their territory. And these pipelines literally would fuel climate change. And in response to that, here in Ontario, we've had the Mohawk of Tyendinaga supporting those actions by trying to shut down and succeeding in shutting down railways just before the pandemic started last year in 2020. And then up north, we have more recently Inuit hunters who are resisting mining activities in the far north and in the Arctic. So literally from coast to coast to coast, our Indigenous communities are on the front lines of climate justice. And so it's really important that we take time to acknowledge their involvement in this fight and also to send gratitude for the work that they continue to do. Okay, a few quick pointers. So my name is Leigh, and I'm a coordinator at SciXchange. I'll be moderating the panel today, and I'm super excited to get to our panelists. First, I want to introduce a few folks who are helping me out. Amber Sandy is going to be moderating the Q&A. And so if you have questions for the panelists throughout the event, you can pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom. And yeah, and we'll get to those questions at any time, or sorry, at the end of the event. My colleague Adisa is going to be helping us out with some engagement pieces during the event, so we'll meet him shortly. And then my colleague Stephanie is going to be in the background, so if you run into any issues, please feel free to send her a message through the chat function or through the Q&A function. She'll be monitoring both of those. Okay, so I'm super excited about our panelists. We're not going to meet them just yet. We're getting close though. But when I was first putting together this panel, I thought that having the theme of science, policy, and action would be really good. SciXchange is the outreach office for the Faculty of Science here at Ryerson, and so we love looking at the intersection of science with policy. That's one of the main things that we do, and using science and science communication to inform decision making. And then in order to make an impact on climate, we really need that action piece to ensure that policies are being implemented and action is being taken on climate justice issues. the more I thought about this, I kind of thought that we'd have one speaker doing science, one speaker doing policy, and one speaker doing action. And the more I thought about this and researched some of the amazing folks you're gonna hear from really soon, it became really apparent to me that folks within the climate movement have to do all of those things. They have to know the science. They have to push for progressive policies that address climate change, and they have to be able to take action on the ground within their communities. And so I think you'll find when you meet our three speakers that they have been doing amazing work on all three fronts here. And so that's why I'm so excited to have them here today. So before we meet our speakers, we're going to hear from the main organizers of Solve Climate by 2030. This is an initiative that's coming from Bard College in New York, and the main organizer has a message for us.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 US states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the two hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice, and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinars homework for the students, and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world, asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forwards, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Okay. Lovely. So I'm going to invite Adisa to share his screen now. And we're going to use Mentimeter. I think Steph is going to drop into the chat a link you can use, or you can go to menti.com and put in the code 7333-2702. And we'll just give folks a moment to get logged in here. We're going to be talking a lot about climate justice today. And so we want to know, what do you think climate justice is? What words do you associate with climate justice? So each of our speakers is going to give their own definition of what climate justice is. But we first want to see what some of the ideas are that you have. All right, sorry that that went a bit too quickly. There we go. Thanks, Adisa. Wonderful. Yes, I love all of these ideas. So a really interesting mix of actions that are associated with climate justice, and also some of the societal impacts that we need to change and work on in order to ensure that we're creating a just and sustainable world. Lovely. I love that urgent is one of the bigger words there. Necessary, yes. Amazing. Okay, we're going to pause there and go to the second question. And I'll ask you to send your thoughts in for this one. So we want to know, what are some of the actions that you take or have taken to try and solve climate? And Mentimeter is a bit slow sometimes, so we're going to keep that open, and you're going to keep on adding your thoughts to that. And Adisa is going to look at all of your answers towards the end and let us know what some of the main actions are that folks are taking right now. Fantastic. Okay, so if you didn't get a chance to enter in your idea yet, please go ahead and do so. But for now, we're going to move into our panel. Our speakers are very eager to get to know you and to share some of their ideas. So we're going to start off by allowing our speakers to introduce themselves and talk about their involvement in the climate justice movement and the work that they do. And they're also going to give us a definition of what climate justice is. So Ruby, I'll start off with you. I'm super excited to have you here on the panel. Ruby is from Fridays for Future Toronto, which is an organization that began out of Greta Thunberg's climate strike on Fridays. And so she is an absolute powerhouse. She's been organizing with them for a few years now and is super, super inspiring. So I will let her take it away, and we look forward to hearing more from you, Ruby.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Ruby Swartz. I am an 18-year-old climate activist from so-called Toronto, which is the land of the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Wendat. I have been organizing around climate justice for a little bit less than 2 years, and I primarily organize with Fridays for Future Toronto. I organize kind of a lot of different things. I do like strikes and different like community like outreach projects and stuff. But then I also do a lot of organizing around education and educating youth about the crisis and action that they could take on the climate crisis. I want to take a minute, actually, in my introduction to acknowledge that today is Yom HaShoah, which is the Jewish Holocaust Commemoration Day. And since we're going to be talking about like climate justice and white supremacy and like racism throughout the next like hour and a half, I think it's important to acknowledge and remember the like violence that happened against like my people and other Jews and the census murders that happened. But also to me, this day is pretty special because very purposefully we remember the Holocaust on the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where primarily youth stood up to like Nazis and white supremacy in the face of like a genocide and like certain death. And a big reason I'm an activist and I do what I do is that I grew up in a like other Jewish youth movement. And this movement was actually like one of the main organizers of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And so like really in a lot of ways, like the people who came before me like did this very like, I don't know if like we celebrate heroism today, basically. And like, I just think that's interesting to acknowledge. In terms of like, what is climate justice? I think it's important to understand that the climate crisis doesn't happen separately from all of the other systems that exist in our society and all of the like systems of oppression in our society. And so when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about this idea that the people who are going to bear the brunt of this crisis are generally the people who are not only the least equipped to deal with that, but also contributed the least to the crisis. So these are people living in like developing countries. These are, you know, people living in poverty. These are people of color. These are Indigenous people. In many cases, these are women. These are people with disabilities. And it's important to understand that. I also like to think about, when I think about climate justice, I also think about it in terms of some aspect of hope. The idea that I'm somebody who lives in this world and sees systemic racism and like wealth inequality, and it's pretty messed up and pretty upsetting. And understanding that in order to solve the climate crisis, we need to address colonialism and these sort of root causes of all of these bigger problems gives me hope that we might be able to also solve like systemic racism, etc. Yeah, that's sort of my spiel. I will pass it on to another panelist or back over to you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much, Ruby. I'll invite Amita up next. So I first, I guess, virtually met or came to know Amita through their campaign for leader of the Green Party this past summer, and they ran a really amazing platform that I think hasn't really been seen in Canadian politics yet, and gave me a lot of hope for actually involving folks who wouldn't normally or haven't been given access to political voices in the past. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to have them here today. Please welcome Dr. Amita Kuttner.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'll say on that, most of the compliments should also go to my fantastic team, because I certainly was not an individual in that endeavor. So thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Amita Kuttner. I use they, them pronouns. I am speaking with you all from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and it is my commitment to see these stolen lands returned. How did I get started in climate justice? Well, during my PhD in astrophysics, or while I was getting my PhD in astrophysics, I realized that I couldn't keep watching the suffering and destruction in the world around me, and that I wanted to dedicate myself and my energy towards ensuring our survival, our ability to flourish with our planet and not against it. And also in the same way, ensuring our continued ability to explore our beautiful universe. This desire to work on this was also driven by my personal experience of extreme weather, having lost my mother and my home to a mudslide when I was only 14. And that's where I grew up in North Vancouver, which is unceded Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish territory. I was also pulled into climate justice, climate activism, and politics and policy by the lack of policy around technology. And so I decided to run for office. I was in the US for my PhD, so I headed home and I ran for parliament in 2019 in Burnaby North Seymour, served as science and innovation critic for the Green Party for a couple of years, brought forward policy around artificial intelligence and job automation and such things, all directly interconnected. And then last year, after some encouragement, I ran for leadership of the Green Party. And yeah, we brought forward something which I think we were indicated that the world and the country wasn't ready for. And I challenged that, because I think that this is what we need. We need a holistic approach, we need a just approach, and we need a scientific approach. But I have now moved on and co-founded a nonprofit called Moonlight Institute. And we're trying to fill gaps in policy, in organizing, and really present frameworks for a just and equitable future that is also sustainable. And this is through creating policy, through organizing, through community projects, and also presenting a radical viewpoint of society and future. To me, climate justice is the necessary approach to facing the climate crisis without leaving anyone behind. It's intersectional, and it's seeing that the well-being of everyone is important, and the current unjust and inequitable functioning of society is intertwined and also a cause of the climate crisis. So bringing justice to every single person, seeking collective liberation, will also absolutely bring us to a place where the climate crisis is solved. We need to co-solve everything, and this is also an effective method, but it's definitely necessary. So thank you. Look forward to talking about everything today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amita. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Dr. Luckerzia Awuor. I first became aware of her work when she won the gold medal at Ryerson. She recently graduated with a PhD in environmental management. And I was super excited to have her on the panel because her work really looks at the intersection of climate change and public health. And I think that now that we are in the middle of a global pandemic, there's no better time than now to look at those two things together. And so I'm really excited to introduce her and hear her thoughts about her work and about climate justice. Welcome, Dr. Awuor.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So again, my name is Luckerzia, and I'm joining you from Whitby, Ontario, which is located in the traditional territory of the Mississaugas covered by the Williams Treaty. And so I think for me, before I begin, I really wanted to bring in what climate change justice means to me, because that really connects what I do and the research that I do. And so what I see as climate justice, first of all, is really the need to reframe climate change from purely greenhouse gas emissions or economic or environmental issues to the focus on human and civil rights, because that recognizes the disproportionate implications of climate change, the need for meaningful and inclusive decision-making, as well as working together to create a better future for our next generations. And so why is this important? So this really came in when I started doing my actually master's in environmental applied science. And I found a lot of gaps, scientific gaps, which continued to show us that achieving collective goals of climate change management has remained elusive and also disproportionate. And what does that really mean? What it really meant when I read through and did my research was that the institutions that have been put in place to address climate change do not fit with the current ecological systems, which is the environment, as well as the social systems, which again talks about people and how we interact with the environment, how we understand our impacts, as well as the consensus on the actions that are required. And so the gap that emerged and how to address it really was that in order for us to address this mismatch is really to present climate change in a way that people understand. And what happens again with research, what I found was that a public health frame has been forwarded as really the most effective way of presenting climate change. And so that's where my really work came into, where apart from my research, really what I do as a health professional is I identify, prioritize, and manage environmental and health hazards in order to promote positive and equitable health outcomes that consider the social, economic, environmental factors. However, my research advances that public health framed climate change discourse and decision making, which is, when you talk about climate change framing, is really presenting or communicating or discussing climate change through health terms. And why is that important, and why did I focus on that? Because it has been identified that public health framing presents climate change in a manner that influences actions as well as understanding of our role, understanding the impacts. Why? Because it resonates with the public. It provides them with relatable risks. And for instance, people can understand the health implications of air quality resulting from climate change, as opposed to the complicated jargons of carbon pricing or carbon footprints. And also because as a public health professional, I could see that public health practice is founded in 3 areas. We have the social determinants of health, justice, and equity. And those all address health outcomes by targeting all these areas of social, economic, environmental, and biological factors that hinder people from achieving good health. Again, that's where justice comes in as well. And for us to be able to achieve this in public health, they have to work and coordinate with others who are also in non-health sectors, because that's how public health achieves its objectives to promote health. And so that's the reason why I really got involved in the work that I do, and also in my research to promote climate justice and really to advance the public health framing of climate change. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So as you can see, we have an amazing lineup of speakers who are deeply entrenched in climate justice and working every single day to try and further those goals. So I'm going to get started with a few questions that I have for them, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all. So the first question, I've kind of already outed myself as a scientist. That's my background academically and professionally. And so I want to know, how do you use science to support the work that you do on climate justice? And perhaps we'll go in the same order that we started in. So Ruby, do you want to take the question first?
Yeah. I would say I am very much not a scientist. Of the people here, I'm probably the least of a scientist. Most of what I do is community organizing and community mobilization, which means that listening to what scientists tell me and tell us is even more important, because honestly, like, I'm not the kind of person who's going to go and do that research. And so looking at the numbers and like looking at the statistics we're being told and like looking at like the timelines that, you know, like scientists are telling us that we need to be making in order to save the planet, is really important, because then we can organize actions around that. We can organize responses to like disasters and things that, you know, like take place. We can like plan for the future, if that makes sense. So I think like we sort of use science to inform what we're demanding and what we're organizing around, and also who we should be prioritizing, because I think with a lot of climate justice, it's not like we just sort of say, oh, like it would be great if there wasn't all these oppressive systems. Like it is like a fact that like radicalized people and people with disabilities are going to be more like disproportionately affected by this pandemic. I mean, not this pandemic, the climate crisis. Everything's about the pandemic now. Yeah, and so also like using science and what we're being told around that to know who we should be prioritizing and who we have to, like where our focus should be, is really helpful, especially as like young people who are trying to figure out how to like completely change our system and combat this like giant issue. Yeah, and then I also really want to briefly touch on, I think a lot of the time, at least in like my work, I hear, you know, the sort of like one-sided way of going about organizing, you know, that it has to be always about these social movements and just about that. And the reality is also like we are going to need scientific innovation to solve the climate aspect of climate justice. Like the thing I think of off the top of my head is like concrete and steel, which are like two things that are like like we use for so much of our infrastructure. Our means of producing those like creates massive carbon emissions. And so also understanding that not everybody is necessarily able to do social organizing and to do community work, but like the work that people in like the public health field and people in the science field do around this is also like super valuable, and sort of like it's all intertwined, if that makes sense. That like if you were to take out that like science aspect, then we couldn't get climate justice anyway, because you need both the justice and the climate. Yeah, that's, I guess, my thoughts on that.
Awesome. Amita?
Thanks. Yeah, to me, I mean, science is absolutely fundamental to anything we're doing around climate, but it's also my background and a methodology to approach solutions and communication. But I think it's important to note that the interpretation and use of science and data has not always been positive, to put it lightly. So-called science has historically been used to entrench and enforce white supremacy. So it's one of those things that when using science for justice, we have to be very careful with the way we approach it, and we have to keep that kind of intersectional lens going and really dig into making sure that our scientific methodology is not continuing to entrench the patriarchy and white supremacy. But to me, the scientific viewpoint is about the immovable facts of climate change, and it's about having scientific literacy, being able to communicate science to people in a way that we actually get that much larger understanding of what science is and also what climate science is telling us. But for me personally, it's also the astronomical viewpoint, the way of taking a step back, seeing the Earth as whole, seeing myself as intrinsically interconnected to my ecosystem and everybody around me, my family of humans and non-human animals and plants as well, that I rely on. And when it comes to, you know, explaining this, we need to bridge science from that very hard and cold place into the warm one, the one of connection, the one where science actually becomes that understanding of our place within the world and the universe, where I often sit looking back from black holes way too far away. But it also goes to the basics of how we think about something like the timeline for 2030, for instance, because so often we say we have 10 years. No, we have 10 years to turn everything completely around, and every minute matters. And so anytime within that 10 years, and even the way we conceptualize numbers and our understanding of, say, 1.5 degrees, all comes down to scientific and mathematical literacy and communication.
Thank you. And Luckerzia?
Yeah. How would I approach that question really is by looking science, first of all, in two ways, and especially in terms of climate change. We have science, which provides us with the evidence of what's happening in our environment, the changes in, for instance, the temperatures and stuff. But then we also have the social science aspect, which really brings human into this impact. And so that's also looking at the science of human interactions, the science of how language is being used, for instance, to advance climate change needs. And so how I use science in my role is usually by utilizing the environmental public health science, social science theories, as well as the intersection of policy analysis to address climate change by, first of all, producing the knowledge or evidence for advancing better communication and discussion of climate change risks and decisions, as well as promoting participatory approaches to climate change governance. I also use then my evidence to engage policymakers. And so, for instance, I've actually interviewed so many policymakers across Ontario, ministries. I've engaged more than 10 ministries, as well as all the 34 public health units in Ontario, in really ways for integrating the public health needs into the climate change policies, and also for developing a framework for broader stakeholder engagement, because we need to engage different people and meaningfully engagement, not just, providing information, to actually have a two-way conversation about climate change. And the other way that I do that is also by supporting healthy public policies. And so how I've done that, for instance, I've done statistical modeling that shows how we can integrate, for instance, pollution or other environmental factors into the neighborhood equity index in order to allow us to identify the vulnerabilities, as well as, for instance, Indigenous communities that are also being impacted by pollution that is not considered in the neighborhood equity index. Or even other research that I've done is really advancing the surveillance of vector-borne diseases using the existing surveillance practices. And that allows us to identify the populations that are vulnerable, allows us to really integrate those into the policies that we have. So that, yeah, that's how I use science in my work.
Wonderful, thank you. So one of the things I take away from that is that, science does not exist in a vacuum. It doesn't exist in a silo. It affects people. It affects other living beings on this planet. And it's really important for us to learn how to better communicate the science around climate change and better use it to empower the people who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. So thank you very much for those answers. Okay, so Ruby has already started talking about the pandemic subconsciously. And so I'm going to ask about that. We're starting the recovery from the pandemic, and I'm wondering, what do you think Canada's priorities need to be for a just solution or a just transition, to a green economy and or a green recovery from the pandemic? And we will start with Amita.
Thank you. I think this is such an opportunity. Everything has kind of been shown to not function properly. So this is the moment where we should just transform everything. But that is definitely easier said than done for entrenched systems. So I think what we need to focus on is people, community building, and the basics. Because if we empower people, local communities to be able to change, provide guidelines and support to give people agency and give people the ability to get what they need. And by basics, I mean what we now see, or what many people already saw as the basics, but now we have a larger group of people understanding what we really need for life, which is food, water, health, community, family. And these systems need to be local and resilient. And so we need to focus on this, the ability for people to set up these systems to support ourselves and do so in a way that is going to not contribute further to the climate emergency, and also protect us and prepare us for the very on-the-ground reality of the climate emergency. And with this, we need to focus on rights, access, justice, and I think the rest will flow easily from it. And a lot of the solutions exist, and it's just a matter of actually implementing them, whether it be, ecosystem restoration or giving people, access to food and shelter, which is a big deal. And I think access to basics is a way to also address fears. A lot of people are living in extremely precarious lives, and that was true before the pandemic. And those who are marginalized and oppressed now have a worse version of this, and many other people have been woken up to a sort of precarious reality and the fact that society doesn't really function for the basic things we need it for. So addressing that fear, that immediacy, will give all of us a freedom to move forward to a stable and sustainable and hopefully flourishing future for everyone.
And just so following up with what Amita has just said. So for me, before, as a health professional, before we really consider what just green transition would mean, I think we have to consider, first of all, the connection between climate change, green economy, and pandemics. And we are right on the pandemic itself. So we'll give an example of COVID-19 and what's going on. And we see a convergence of commonalities with climate change. And so, for instance, they both in part result from human degradation of the environment. They disproportionately impact the most vulnerable. There is a delay in actions which results in impacts. And it's also a reminder of the intricate relationship between people and the environment. And so when I say this, what I mean is that as we continue to release human-induced greenhouse gases, continue to encroach upon biodiversity, we continue to deplete natural resources, there will be more pandemics to be anticipated, which means there will be more health impacts and losses. And so there is a need to really address the critical interface between all these crises, and we see how the pandemics, biodiversity, and climate change intersect. And so what I really go to, which is an umbrella recommendation, is what the World Health Organization has actually recommended. And so in 2019, World Health Organization prescribed 6 comprehensive actionables for attaining a healthy green recovery, which considers both climate change, COVID-19, and potential future pandemics. And so these involve factors such as addressing biodiversity, addressing climate change, addressing air, water, and food quality, sanitation and hygiene, management of chemicals, approaches to clean energy, as well as developing active and livable cities. However, for these to be able to take action, the successes need to be grounded in meaningful inclusion of varied stakeholders. Because what do we mean by that? We have to provide resources to enable those who will be disproportionately impacted to participate in the decision processes. And we also have to focus on the local needs. It's not just a one-size-fits-all. We have to realize that every local communities have different needs. Every local communities need to be empowered differently. And how you present the climate change impacts will also vary depending on different people. And so that's really how we can recover from the pandemics as well as achieve a green recovery.
I feel a little bit like I'm about to sound like a broken record, because I really want to echo everything that Amita said about like this idea of like localization and community and togetherness as being like this really important part of a green and just recovery from the pandemic. I think back to the beginning of the pandemic when things first shut down, and the like sense of community, the way people were starting to come together for mutual aid, the way that there were people volunteering to deliver food to people in isolation. Like there were so many examples of our communities coming together in a way that I don't think I've ever seen our communities coming together, at least with my local communities. And that was really powerful for me. And I think sort of this like localization of resources and this like putting the responsibility back on our communities to support each other instead of on this sort of like global world is an important part. I also sort of want to highlight that like a lot of the issues that this pandemic has highlighted, things like workers' rights, the need for paid sick days as a way of allowing people to stay home when they're sick and not spreading COVID. These are not new. These issues that have arisen as a result of globalization, these aren't new things. These existed before the pandemic. It's just that the pandemic has caused people to live such a radically different life than we had to before the pandemic that we have had to be more critical of these things. It has highlighted like the failures of our society to do things like support workers. You know, it's not just a coincidence that there has been a lot more talk about systemic racism during the pandemic, because the reality is that the pandemic has highlighted those systemic issues. And so I say that because I think a green recovery gives us an opportunity to address these things that we have needed to address for much longer than just this pandemic. You know, to relocalize our systems and to really like invest in our communities and in, I want to use the word togetherness, and sort of focus on like the sense of togetherness and like the sense of being like, you know, all in this together, and being, I guess, more selfless might be a good word. Yeah, and so I kind of want to focus on that. Yeah, because I think all the policy is sort of specific and also going to be very different depending on where you are. And so, but regardless, like that policy should be focusing on bringing our communities together. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. So we've started talking a little bit about the context in Canada, and we get a lot of media influence from the south of our border. And so I'm wondering, what is one of the differences that you see between Canada and the United States when it comes to climate justice? And we will start with Luckerzia.
Yeah, so what I really find to be that stands out between Canada and US, because again, we get compared a lot. One of them is just the fact that I see that Canada has a national carbon tax mechanism, which is not present in US. And again, that's the first step to climate justice, because you have to take actions by reducing the greenhouse gases. And also what came up, which is, there's a law which is called the Climate Change Accountability Law, which is making a net zero emission commitment into law. And that's a significant step, which will provide legally binding approaches to reducing greenhouse gases. The other thing that I've also seen and I've read about Canada is really their participation in the Paris Agreement's commitment to mobilizing climate change financing in developing countries by committing, I think it is about over 2 billion or 2.65 billion over 5 years. And this has helped farmers in Nepal and helped renewable energy sources in Burkina Faso and in Vietnam. And again, that's something that previously in US we would see, but again, when the new administration came in, prior to the Trump administration came in, those were stuff that were, you know, like cut out. So I think in terms of comparing Canada to US, even though we're not doing enough, I see some actions being taken by the Canadian government. And one thing that I've also read about, which I find interesting, is that Canadians are actually more concerned about climate change compared to people in US. And what this research showed was that 84% of Canadians actually support the international agreements for limiting greenhouse gases. So I think that really shows that, you know what, we can actually mobilize Canadians to be able to achieve some of the greenhouse gas reduction projects that the federal government would like to achieve.
I think I was next in the little order thing. So I want to sort of talk about two completely separate things here, but that are related to this overall topic. First of all, I just want to like put it out there, like kind of really annoys me sometimes the amount that we are compared to the US, because the reality is that like the US and Canada are just like fundamentally different countries. We have different political systems, we have different priorities, we have different political candidates. And to me, it's frustrating because comparing ourselves to the US is in some ways ineffective. Like sort of this idea that I've heard a lot that like that we should be doing the same thing as the US. I think it makes no sense. Even within like so-called Canada, like the way that we're going to go about dealing with the climate crisis in like the Maritimes is going to be different than like Alberta, because they have different economies and different communities. And so it sort of frustrates me, this constant comparison, because I just don't think it's effective. I do, however, want to touch on the fact that both Canada and the US do have foundations in colonialism, and are, while very different, they are both colonial institutions and colonial nations. And I think one thing that sort of both of them should be doing is decolonizing and uplifting Indigenous voices, because there are Indigenous people, you know, in both of those nations. Yeah, so that's more or less what I want to talk about here, was just this idea we're both colonial, and that's a good comparison. But other than that, like, I think pretty much everything is different. We have the same goals, right? We all need to lower our emissions and stuff, but how we're going to do that is just going to be so different, because we're just different places. And that goes back to that whole thing that both me and Amita touched on before, of the idea of like, you know, like sort of localization and community, that like, you know, like sort of so-called Canada is a community, but also like our individual communities are communities. And I think we need to bring the focus sort of to our own policy. And I guess the last thing I'll say here is that I think sometimes sort of what's going on in the US clouds what's going on in Canada. It's sort of so big and so talked about, and especially with, you know, the Trump administration, almost such a show that, and so much more interesting in some ways sometimes in Canadian politics, that people only focus on that, and they, you know, only engage and sort of know about what's going on there, rather than, you know, engaging with the systems that are here and engaging with our politics here. Because I think there's a bit of a vibe that like Canada's better than the US when it comes to like systemic racism and climate justice and stuff, and that is just not really that true. And so yeah, I sort of want to center the discussion on Canada, just because I think it's more effective.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to build on what both Ruby and Luckerzia have said so far, because I have elements of both of those things when I wanted to answer this question. I'll start though with what Luckerzia brought up about, you know, people taking climate change more seriously in Canada. And I think that, you know, I think that people actually get the sense that what we're doing as a country is adequate because of that. And that is kind of a problem in itself. And we have a very different political landscape, but it is very similar. And so there's this minimization of all the problems that Ruby mentioned. And I absolutely think that our attitude in Canada that we're better than the US makes us complacent. And that's very separate from kind of where the governments are, because obviously that oscillates wildly depending on administrations. I spent about a decade living in California, and my sense was, at least within the climate movement there's a sense of urgency that isn't present in kind of a wider audience in so-called Canada, because of this idea that we're fine, we're doing quite well. And so the problem overall has more traction, but the tendency towards action is actually lesser because of kind of that lack of sense of urgency. And I saw that in kind of the stickiness of getting into partisan politics. I don't like partisanship that much, but in the US, in a sense, there's this ease into it, because everybody sees how urgent taking political action is. Whereas in Canada, it's still very awkward, even though it's completely necessary. And honestly, I don't care what party you pick, just go in there and work on it, or try to take it down from the outside, one way or the other, but we need to approach these things that way. And I will also end by saying, yeah, Indigenous rights and sovereignty need to be at the heart of our climate justice work. And the border itself between Canada and the US is a colonial and destructive construct. So that's one starting place for comparative politics.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important to center, I like the way that Ruby put that, center the conversation around Canada, because the US can be dramatic, and I think it can pull attention away from the issues that we need to deal with. And like our panelists have said, you know, we're not okay up here. There are issues that we need to deal with, and making sure that we're focusing on them and not kind of patting ourselves on the back and saying, well, we're better than the US. That isn't going to solve anything at this point. Okay, so I'd like to dive a little bit more into the work that each of you are doing. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you're trying to change the trajectory of your community, the communities that you work with, to face climate change and to create solutions. And we will start with Ruby.
So I'm going to talk about myself for a minute, and then I'm also going to plug some actions that people who I organize with are doing, because it's always important. So first, in terms of stuff that like I'm working on, most of what I work on is around education. So either at more of like a board level, like trying to get the TDSB to actually do anything, you know, to like have climate policies, to get teachers to educate, etc. And also like actually going into schools and into youth groups and into clubs and like talking to kids. Because sort of to me, when I look at how change happens, I sort of see education as being, yeah, TDSB is the Toronto District School Board, for anybody who doesn't know. So when I look at like the sort of how social change happens, I sort of see education as being the base of that. I know for me, growing up sort of in progressive like youth spaces and like learning about different social justice issues my whole life gave me the foundation to be able to organize now. And so a lot of what I do is around giving like really young people, I'm talking like middle school sort of age, like both the knowledge of what's happening, but also trying to give them tools to deal with it in their own heads, because eco-anxiety is a very real thing. And I think a lot of young people sort of see the climate crisis, get really scared, and then just sort of like run the other way. They don't know how to engage with it. They don't know how to take action. It's just this really giant, terrifying thing. And so that, and then also giving them the tools to make change, the tools to make change in their communities and in their schools, and, you know, in their churches or in their family or whatever that might look like for them. And so that's a lot of what I do. And then also I do things like really recently I coordinated our March 19th strike, where we shut down an intersection for like 3 hours to demand the city of Toronto actually meet all of the promises that they said they were going to make when they declared a climate emergency, and then have kind of just not really done, which is very, very, very frustrating, because that climate emergency came as a result of the mobilization of students in September of 2019. And then the city has just sort of like not done that. And then I'm also just going to plug some other actions that are going on in Toronto, because that's what I do. So just some fun things that are being organized by FFTO people right now is we're doing a bank switch campaign with Climate Pledge Collective, where we are getting people to like switch their bank away from banks like RBC and TD, which invest in fossil fuels. There's also currently a campaign going on to get the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan to divest from fossil fuels, again, because fossil fuels are just not a sustainable industry going forward. And then also like we've been doing lots of work around like other, I don't know, issues and like Indigenous communities and like mutual aid and stuff, which you can always find more information about on our Instagram. Yeah, but in terms of myself, it's sort of educating people and giving them the tools to make change in their community, because I can't make change in every single community in the city. That's not realistic. Yeah.
Hey, thank you, Ruby. Yeah, so I'll just follow on from based on what I do mostly is really on research. And so I've done a lot of empowering the public health professionals to take leadership role in climate change, really by providing evidence and what their role can be if they take leadership in climate change, or if they facilitate climate change policy actions. And also by joining environmental group. So I'm a member of the Ontario Public Health Association Environmental Health Work Group. And so what I do with that is really, we look at the proposed environmental programs and provide comments on how to improve the policies that are being proposed by the government. And I also, what I do as well is really advocating for having environmental courses or climate change related courses in the curriculum in universities. And so what I've done with that, especially at Ryerson University, is like, I remember doing a public health course and I only did a 2-hour seminars course on climate change. And we see how climate change is so important in some public health. Yes, this is something that is not included in the curriculum. And I've looked at different curriculums in Ontario and you see a similar pattern. You look at curriculums in other provinces and you see a similar pattern. I've interviewed public health professionals and you find there is a gap in understanding or even sometimes a difference between climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation. You interview environmental professionals and they don't have a clue of what role public health plays in climate change. And so there's just that disconnect. And so my work is really more advocating and also empowering both public health and non-public health professionals to identify, because what really connects us to climate change as humans, if you look at it in the long term, is health. Everything else is going to be impacted, the social aspects, the environmental aspects. And what that happens is eventually it impacts human health. So public health has a big role to play, yet we find that most of the time they're not even included. I've interviewed people in Ontario, ministries in Ontario, and public health is not even a part of committees that are discussing climate change policies. And so for me, I'm doing a lot of advocacy work in that, just to really complement what is the policies. There are policies, but just how we are approaching them is not effective to address climate change. And that's really what I do.
Well, I am going to address this with a little bit of different definition of community, both because I live in a different area, but also because I am approaching community from, well, I think starting from an astronomical perspective. So I kind of like, oh, my community is global. But then also I think, you know, maintaining that connection between very local work, which I think is extremely important. And, you know, for me, that means the small island that I live on and working on actually, say, getting to a place of food security on our own island and getting ready for the changing climate and the, you know, threats of fire in summer, et cetera, and drought, but also, you know, getting involved in municipal kind of politics, especially for emergency preparedness, and then going up from that. So how can I help the entirety of, you know, the so-called Canada community, and how that then links in globally. So my work now is definitely focused with my nonprofit Moonlight Institute, and our goal is to create frameworks that can be widely shareable. So, you know, there's a lot of amazing work being done, but it's not particularly documented in a way someone else can then copy. So if you want to set up anything like how can I learn to feed myself or feed my community, there's so many people who know how to do that, but how do I go look up how to do that? So we're working on doing that, but also creating the policy frameworks that actually look at, you know, effective systems of decolonial governance, or actually how to integrate tech in a way that is ethical and seeks to create good for people instead of capital, and in a way that, you know, safeguards justice and safety. And I'm also on my own, you know, personally trying to decolonize the way that I think on the inside of my head and share that with the people around me so that we can work better. I'm also working on helping people face trauma and uncertainty. This is something that I went through, and we, you know, digging into the idea of the middle road. It's really hard for people to face a future that is the gray area between everything is fine and complete destruction. And that's what we're going through. So to build up that resilience, to work on the fear, supporting people in their ability to feel capable of facing the climate emergency and what will come, so that we can end up on the other side of it. And all of that is within the capacities of the nonprofit organization as we split into, you know, media and communications, policy projects, and then also community projects, looking to create frameworks, share frameworks, and also just create and bring people into this much larger conversation of what we want our future to look like.
Amazing, thank you. So I think that's given us a really great kind of broad picture of some of the policy issues that each of you are working on. You all come at this or these issues from a really different perspective. And so I think it's been really amazing to hear how work has to be done on so many different fronts in order to make sure that we're pushing forward on climate justice. I'm going to invite Adisa up now. He's going to be sharing our participants' answers from our question at the beginning and talking a little bit about what are some of the actions that everyone, all the participants are taking to solve climate. And then we're going to get into hearing from our panelists about what they think our folks, our participants should be doing to solve climate. So Adisa, take it away.
All right, hi everyone. Just wanted to share some of the responses that our participants provided today. A lot of them were centered around education and advocacy. As you can see here, I summarized a lot of them around the same types of people advocating within their schools, people actually going out and forming committees for broader advocacy, as well as looking for the ways they can get companies and the government to be more responsible for what is going on with the climate situation. Another person actually mentioned technology as well, which is pretty big because that's, if you think about it, it's part of research, which lends itself to education. Also, a lot of individual choices, people speaking about changing the way they changing their diets and conserving energy at home, and not just simply not wasting things that unnecessarily, which is actually a pretty good part. It's a simple thing that we could actually do. And one person also mentioned joining the Solve Climate by 2030 internship initiative. So that's pretty good. Go out there and really do your best and just give it a shot. Okay, that's what we can really ask for. Everyone just do their best to help with this climate issue. All right, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks Adisa. Okay, so we're gonna, so it's super amazing. It is always so exciting to see actions that everyday folks are taking, that folks are taking every day to make the world a little bit more sustainable, make the world a little more just. And so I'm going to turn it back to our panelists to talk a little bit about what is one action that you think each individual should take, can take to contribute to meaningful and just climate solutions. And just before we jump into that, I want to let you know that our question and answer period is going to start after this question. We've already had a number of really awesome questions and we will try to get to all of them, but feel free to drop those into the Q&A button through the bottom there. Okay, so who wants to start first? I'll leave it up to the panelists.
Okay, I can start.
Awesome, take it away.
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's important first of all to recognize that we have different participants here, but overall, what I would really like how each and every person should contribute is really to advocate for and take part in decisions that impact the environment. And why do I say that? Most of the policies that are being made are made by politicians. They have a term that they're supposed to be in office. And every time someone else comes in or a new government comes in, they have different priorities. So when they put in the policies, they're the ones who have power. However, you can shift that power by advocating for what you want, by taking part in the decisions that you make, because that means that the policies that are being put in place go beyond the terms that politicians are in office. And that's really the way that we're going to overcome this, because we've seen the partisan division in climate change policies. And it's evident in Ontario, where the Liberals came in and they had the climate change policies. The Conservatives come in and they raise it all. However, if we actually mobilize people and take part, then that can be targeted. And the one thing that I also have is really, it's important to be a part of the solution. So it's one thing to say stuff, but if you want to see change, you also have to be a part of that change. And so we have to assess and reduce our carbon footprints, and again, really take part in that. So that's what I would advise.
If you're done, I'll go next. I actually think my response to this question is going to do a really good job of answering some of the questions that I see in the Q&A thing, asking about like individual like choices and lifestyle changes. So it's all working out. Yeah, so I think the really important thing here is to understand that this is a huge systemic issue. Each of us are not responsible for it. I would go to last night, I was having a really rough eco-anxiety night, and I was talking to a friend of mine because I was feeling guilty about the fact that I'm going to have to fly multiple times a year in order to go to university. And she reminded me that, that's not my fault. And that like, the reality is that I could make all the lifestyle changes I want. I could go vegan, I could, be completely zero waste. I could, never fly, never use a car, and that would not solve the climate crisis. And so I think like, our society wants us to think it's our responsibility to do it all individually. That it's, us using plastic straws, that it's us driving our car, that it's us not recycling. And yes, like, sure, those things are important and they do help. But what's more important is like looking at this at the systemic level, is like mobilizing around this, is engaging with this huge issue, like as a community and like as sort of like people together. I really like to use the analogy of like a cup, where achieving climate justice is this cup overflowing. And any little drop that you can add to this cup of like water gets us closer to that goal, right? And so in terms of like what one action is I would say like engage with a campaign in your area, like follow Instagram accounts, like follow groups in your area. And like when they have a campaign where you need to like email politicians, like send that email. When you see that there's a protest happening, like go to the protest, like show up. And if you're not someone who can do that, like educate yourself, have conversations about this stuff, like with your friends, because even just like talking about it and normalizing that this is a crisis, it's an emergency, we're not doing enough, is important. But like sort of last thing I want to talk about here in terms of that idea of like talking to each other, is that like, in September, at least in Toronto, there was like thousands of people that took to the streets. Why was that? Well, because caring about climate was a trend. And so from the perspective of like young people, when we continue to talk about it and we make it trendy to care about systemic issues, and we make it trendy to take action and to like go to protests and stuff, then huge numbers of us will mobilize, and that can make change. So yeah, I hope that, because I also sort of tried to answer the question while I was in there, but like, yeah, at the end of the day, like that the focus is communally and on the system. Yeah.
I will follow right up in that. I would say if I had to pick, one thing for people to do, I would say learn and then take responsibility for that knowledge. And this is around justice and intersectionality. Learn about the diverse impacts and experiences that many, many people have across different backgrounds, and the intersectionalities of effects as well, and how different systems work, and then inject this into everything. Teach others, bring other people this knowledge, share it and help them learn as well. And entrench the idea at every single opportunity that we need and we can have liberation for all, and that this will be a climate just future, a resilient and a beautiful one. And that all our problems are so deeply intertwined with each other because our systems are problematic, white supremacist, and patriarchal. We are a part of nature, and separating humanity from it in the way we think about and approach any of it entrenches this problem. So learn and take responsibility, question everything constantly, and be compassionate with yourself and others.
Wow. Okay. Just going to give a minute to let all of those things sink in. And I'm very pleased to welcome my colleague Amber Sandy, who's going to take it from here and finish off with our Q&A session. So Amber, over to you.
Ani, everyone, it's been such an honor to sit here and listen to this panel discussion. I've learned lots. All of you are really incredible activists, and I'm really excited to have been here and to just participate a little bit. So we have about just under 15 minutes left for questions, and we have quite a few coming into the Q&A here. So I'll just read off some questions, and then whoever feels like addressing it can go for it. The first one that I see that we can talk about is, can you folks define what intersectional environmentalism means or looks like to you?
Hey, I think in addressing that, when you think of that, it's really an intersection of really addressing the disproportionate impacts of the environment of, for instance, climate change, as well as addressing a healthy planet. So you're kind of combining these two. And that really still relates to environmental justice in a sense, because with environmental justice, you're trying to make sure that people who will be disproportionately impacted by climate change are their needs are met within the policies. But when we're doing that, we are also taking care of the environment by making sure that our policies are also addressing the implications of greenhouse gases in the environment. So it's kind of similar and related, where it addresses both the injustices as well as addressing the environment or the environmental impacts that we're putting. And because what happens is that when we are impacting the environment, the people who are mostly going to be impacted are those who, for instance, are marginalized, who did not even take part, for instance, in the greenhouse gas emissions that we're emitting into the environment. So by doing that, we are actually addressing both, and that's how I can that's how I understand, and that's how I can answer it.
I'll just add briefly to that, if that's all right, because I completely agree with that definition. I think for me that it's also comes from a very core personal place. So I see it that way, but I also feel it that way, as in I am fighting for my rights and my ability to exist in society at the same time. And that's not something I can stop doing. And I cannot stop caring for everybody else that is also, marginalized and oppressed to different degrees and in different ways. But instead of, stacking it up and saying, well, how much is this person dealing with or that person dealing with, it is seeing that the overall impacts that everybody has, but in not separating those things anymore, because it's for anybody experiencing it is so essential to our very existence and our survival, both making sure that the climate is livable and that we can exist in society without, that we can live at all.
And okay, I'll go on to the next one. Myself as an Anishinaabe Kwe, I often think about my own communities and how much we can't really have climate justice without really considering Indigenous communities, and also really thinking about how important it is for our own communities to have sovereignty over our lands and continue to be the caretakers that we have been taught to be forever, since time immemorial. And I see somebody here has mentioned, can you touch more on Indigenous sovereignty and centering indigeneity as a whole in this movement? And so starting off, I want to recognize that none of you are Indigenous to Canada on this panel, so it's a little bit different, but I'm totally interested in hearing your input on this as well.
I guess I will definitely speak on this. Something that's been really impactful for me over the last 2 years of organizing is really coming to terms with this idea that Indigenous people lived on this land for thousands of years before like colonizers came and they took care of this land in a sustainable way. And, you know, like colonizers and, you know, like Europeans, et cetera, like did not come here that long ago. Like it's really like quite a new thing in the grand scheme of humanity. And we have completely like destroyed it. And I think like really understanding that, like that's like, it's not that we say that we should be decolonizing and we don't say land back just because it's this great idea. I think it's something that like, at least like I like truly believe is important. Like I truly believe we cannot get a solution without recentering that. And then also, I mean, there's like that, like, you know, colonial institutions have just like oppressed and continue to treat Indigenous people like horribly, and there is like no excuse for it. And that's also part of why I think it's really important to be, why we really strive to center Indigenous voices as well as like other like marginalized groups, is like understanding like in our society, like they are not given a voice. And so it is the responsibility of the people who are given a voice in our society to uplift them whenever we can. And that's sort of my thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can add on to that, and that's actually really relevant in what we're discussing now. When you talk about climate justice, there are always two components just justice in general. There are usually two components. So one of them is what's called the distributive justice, which looks at how do we accommodate people who will be disproportionately impacted by climate change to ensure equitable outcomes across the society. The second one is where you talk about procedural justice and how are we engaging these people in the policies, because they have a voice to, you know, participate. And so in terms of Indigenous communities, looking at the first injustice, we are finding that just look even in Canada, they're the ones who are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. We are seeing changes, and even in public health, for instance, changes in vector-borne diseases or even vectors such as Lyme, black-legged tick, moving further north. Yet we are finding that with climate change, this is going to get worse. But do they have programs for monitoring that? No, they're not. We are looking about West Nile virus. It's moving further north. Are they monitoring those surveilling in Indigenous communities? No. So these are people who are going to be disproportionately impacted. They're losing their lands to flooding, and so much is changing, yet their voices are not equally integrated so that they're taking part in the policies. And so other than just acknowledging the disproportionate impacts that they're going to have, the second part comes in is they need to be included. And it's really relevant in what's called ecology, kind of like Indigenous knowledge that needs to be integrated in climate change. How are you going to do that if you don't include them in the climate change decision-making processes? And to be able to meaningfully do that, it's not just about providing them information, because that's what we call tokenism. They have to be actually included fully by engaging them in two-way discussions where they're actually providing you with the knowledge that they have, providing you with how they feel about what's going on to them. And that allows then meaningful engagement as well as integration of their concerns into the policies that are Canada's, for instance, even in Canada, that are addressing climate change. And you can only do that, first of all, also if you provide them with resources that they need. And one thing, for instance, that we find, and it's even in Ontario or in Canada, what happens is that there are, because of the Bill of Rights, they have an environmental registry where if a government wants to have policies, they post them there. How many people even know that there's a policy that has been posted to address something on climate change? So the information that we're providing has to be accessible. It has to be provided to them in a way that they understand it in their own language so that they can be able to take part. We have to also understand that we provide them with resources that they need to be able to participate in those actions. And so really that's how we're going to address the injustices that Indigenous communities are going through, by both considering the distributive justice as well as the procedural justice, so that they can take part and actually see a reduction in impacts in the future, now and in the future.
If I may add, I just want to say that, you know, what has been important to me is to never speak on behalf of Indigenous people, because or engage in that direct kind of tokenism, because I find it so disgusting. And what I have found from my own work in kind of attempting to make colonial spaces inclusive has been this tendency to then just shift all the work and all the blame onto marginalized people, and in this case, Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. And so I'm trying to take personal responsibility for doing some of the work that I can do without speaking on behalf, which is to basically go in and work on extremely unsafe spaces and, racist ideas, and to say, hey, how much can I just bring settlers into the knowledge of colonialism and the history of it, to give people some of the background that can become a foundation for true nation-to-nation interaction. Because basically being on the boundary of that in policy has shown me how far things are apart. So if there's anything that I can do to help settlers start to unpack away from the people that would be harmed by that process, that's what I want to be able to do.
Awesome, thank you. Those are really, really interesting answers, and I appreciate all of your input on that. We could do a whole panel discussion on that topic alone. There's so many ideas buzzing in my brain now because of this. It looks like we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask one more question. And we have so many incredible questions. Thanks so much to everybody for submitting your questions. I wish we could get to them all. But the last one I'm going to finish up with is, what do you think are the problems in regards to communicating the science of climate change? Why is it difficult to make the public or non-scientists understand the importance of climate change and to take action?
Well, I can start. As a non-scientist, I would talk about one thing, because I could talk about this for an entire panel as well. But the focus here, I think, is fear. I honestly think that people see the climate crisis and they just don't know what to do. It is too overwhelming. It's too scary. It encompasses so many things. It's the climate, but it's also systemic racism, it's capitalism, it's colonialism. It is so complex and vast that I think people see it and they're like, okay, I'm out. Like, this is too much. No, thank you. And I think that's a big part of the problem, honestly, is that there isn't a way of communicating this crisis to people in a way that is easily manageable. It's just not this easily manageable thing, at least in my experience. But I would also say that I think science as a thing is, the more and more I sort of grew up in a lot of STEM spaces, and the older I've gotten, I have left those because I didn't really feel accepted in those most of the time. And I think that's a other important thing. I, for example, received a lot of sexism as someone who is very much a woman, in a lot of science spaces. And that made me not want to engage with science and not wanted to engage with the science things and have discussions about that. Is that sort of science, and I think academia tends to be put out very much as this sort of sometimes a little bit elitist thing. And that's a hard reality. It's not something that is always accessible to sort of the more marginalized communities.
I want to follow exactly on that point and talk about this this anti-intellectual sentiment, which is super complicated, because on the one hand, it is absolutely entrenched by the fact that the scientific community and academia is completely exclusionary and problematic in its own way, but also on the other side of that, this pushback against knowledge of any kind. And that isn't just about scientific knowledge and wisdom in any way. So that's an issue, which could take multiple, dissertations. But also just, I think there's this basic scientific communication problem where we haven't been able to talk about, or reduce complicated scientific reality in a way that's palatable and digestible to people. And this relates to multiple things, but one of them is definitely just the fact that we have not managed to have scientific literacy from the very base. in our education system, so that when people are explained scientific things, it doesn't actually land in the way that it's supposed to. And this definitely comes down to things as well, like mathematical literacy. And also I think the systems that we have in education to teach people this, because I can just straight up say they didn't work for me and they are exclusionary. So, you know, we cannot put the responsibility of scientific and mathematical literacy onto the individual and say, why didn't you get this? It is a systemic problem, the way that it's approached. But once you're there, you know, it has immediate impacts. We look at both climate crisis and the pandemic, and you have people publishing statistics. No one knows how to interpret that. And that's not anyone's fault, but we need to actually basically invest in figuring out how to get this information out in a way that makes sense to everybody and in basically a culturally reasonable way.
That's interesting. Yeah. So I'm just going to kind of follow up on that, because again, that's really the area that I'm also trying to focus on, because I've realized how much there is lack of better communication of climate change. And that is something that has actually been shown in literature, where they're actually referring to it as hypocognition. So not having an appropriate way of providing the information. And when you look at it, and again, I still go back to what the two aspects that I talked about. We look at climate change as a scientific phenomenon, but we also need to connect that as a social phenomenon. Yes, science provides us with all this evidence. However, for people to be able to understand, they have to be in a way, in a language that they can relate to. And that's where the framing comes from. So for instance, if you look at framing just in general terms, you have a frame in your house, and it's really used to enhance the image that is within it. And the way we frame climate change provides that image. And we have people who focus on economic impacts or advantages of having the climate change policies. We have people who focus on the injustices that are resulting from climate change. We also have people who focus on the environmental factors. However, what happens is that those are only focusing on one aspect. We have to find a way where we can communicate that, and that's where public health comes in, because we look at how public health and the social determinants of health incorporates economic, social, environmental, injustice, equity into one, and then using that in a way that people can relate to, and then also involving other people, because how someone might understand a public health phenomenon, or how something impacts their health, or how something is an advantage to their health, and not just focusing on the really kind of a loss frame, but also what they can gain from it, is different. And it goes back to, again, when you talk about language, and for instance, we're in Zoom, the reason why we call it Zoom is because someone gave it that, and us as societies can relate to that as what it is as Zoom. And that's the same way. You have to use a language that people can relate to be able to understand what climate change is on a personal note, and that allows them to see the impacts and the actions that are needed, and how their own actions actually contributes to an advantage in their health, or the lack of action can lead to a disadvantage in their health. So it's really connecting both the science and the social aspects through language, because it is through that framing that once they have that climate change image, that then translates into policies that institutions use. And so if politicians are focusing on climate change and economic issues, that's why you see they're going to focus on policies that only address economic impacts, and others are being left behind. So it's really connecting those two things and bringing them all together.
Incredible. I agree with each one of you. It really makes me think about my time spent in community, and hearing those stories from my own community members and my friends and teachers, and hearing about, you know, their experiences as young children in those areas, and how much that differs from what we're experiencing today. So just things like that. We're at 5 minutes past 4 now. So we're going to end it here. And on behalf of SciXchange and everybody involved, I really want to thank each one of you for taking your time to be here today and sharing everything that you have with us. And if anybody else has any follow-up questions, feel free to email us at SciXchange. Thank you so much again. Each of you are incredible, and I'm just so honored to have been able to be a part of the Q&A for this event. Miigwech.